name is Rhea Levy, as you all know, and thank you so much for joining us again this evening for another courageous conversation. And this evening, we know that we're discussing William Lloyd Garrison, and I am hoping, today I had to actually write up another presentation for our next courageous conversation, which will be W.E.B. Du Bois. And I just want the public to know that this is not an ordinary book discussion. We go beyond the book. So we're not repeating a lot of the information in the book, but rather it's a jump start. However, this is why we have Brian Allnutt here this evening. Brian Allnutt is a historian and he works at Northampton Community College, and he's going to give the public background information about William Lloyd Garrison. Usually we have Saul Levy here. He's in the background listening, so he's here, but he's not here, but I'm sure.
But he's here, but not here. Okay.
It's like an oxymoron, right? You can't see his face, but he's lurking in the background. And so this evening, we want to take a look at the concept of integration and whether or not that is a good or a positive concept when we think of our society. And as I was thinking about, William Lloyd Garrison and his ideologies, a couple of thoughts came to mind. And I was, one of the things that came to mind for me is, should we keep our ethnic identity, integrate our culture in the place we call home, or should we assimilate and embrace another culture? And again, William Lloyd, I'm actually looking at my notes as I am mulling through these thoughts through my mind. And Garrison, as I was reading Kendi's book, he made clear his preference for gradual equality. Retreating on equality, he outlined process for civilizing Black people to be equal one day, and yet he stridently fought for gradual equality. And thinking about Garrison is, to me, what I will call an integrationist. Even though he believes that slaves should be emancipated from slavery, it doesn't necessarily mean you are free from white oppression. And as we think about, those two things where I said, should we keep our ethnic identity, or should we integrate into our culture, or should we integrate our culture into the place we call home? And as I think about Bethlehem and living in Bethlehem, when the Moravians came to Bethlehem, they met the Native Americans. And so, however, they did not adapt to the Native American way of life. What they did do was they kept their culture, they kept their identity. And as a matter of fact, it was the Native Americans who they wanted to integrate into their culture, as well as the slaves and the Africans. And so therefore is as we think about, Garrison in this discussion this evening, I want us to think about, again, that concept of integration and assimilation into a particular culture. Okay. So Brian, could you give us some background information on William Lloyd Garrison this evening?
Sure. Yeah. Garrison is, he's a New Englander, and he arises really comes to prominence in the early 1830s as part of that early wave of Northern abolitionists. And it's interesting, he is connected early in his life, well, late 1820s, to other causes that kind of oftentimes were enwrapped with abolitionism, causes like temperance eventually women's rights, educational reform, the cause of what was called Sabbatarianism, which is the observance of the Sabbath. These are all reformist movements that really were very, becoming very widespread in the northeastern states, New England, New York State especially. And a lot of people were involved in various aspects of this eventually. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is the name I was going to throw out there, but there are many others. And Garrison is involved in that, but then of course he goes to Baltimore, has a meeting with Benjamin Lundy, who's a Quaker, and of course we have to remember that there was Society of Friends. After having, it's always funny to be historically precise, having a slave-owning background in the 1600s and early 1700s, William Penn was a big slave owner. Quakers came around to the position that slavery is frankly incompatible with Christian doctrine and became leading anti-slavery activists. So it's not surprising Benjamin Lundy is involved in that. And Garrison's not a Quaker, but he meets Lundy, is inspired by him, and gets involved in this idea that Southern slavery is intolerable. The idea that slavery is a crime against, and you do have to bring up the religious aspect. Most of these reformists at the time were involved in some version or other of evangelical Christianity and saw it as part of that Christian movement, and Garrison's one of them. So slavery is like simply incompatible with humanity, with Christian treatment of one's fellow man, etc., and begins putting out this newspaper, The Liberator. And he says, I will be heard, I will be heard, and is really very fervent about this and believes in the idea of immediate abolition. And it's interesting because Benjamin Lundy didn't necessarily see immediate abolition as achievable. He would have preferred it, but he wasn't sure it was achievable. Garrison thinks it must be the cause, immediate abolition. Now, there's a distinction, as Rhea mentioned, between immediate abolition and immediate entrance into refined society. And that is something we'll get into a little bit later. He's not quite he's not quite confident that freed slaves can enter into, en masse, refined, as he sees it, American white society at the time. But he wants immediate abolition, and that puts his life in danger. I mean, bear in mind, Garrison made a lot of very undiplomatic statements about the South, about the American Constitution, which he saw as a pact with the devil, as being a pro-slavery document from the beginning. He at one point publicly burned the Constitution, was pulled through the streets of Boston with a noose around his neck at one point. Many abolitionists faced violent physical threats, and of course, he's not alone in that. Of course, at this point, you do have to bring up, lest we get carried away with white abolitionists like Garrison, there's obviously a very strong, fervent Black abolitionist movement, going along with it also. So it's important not to be too paternalistic about it. Say, only whites are abolitionists, obviously not. Before Garrison began putting out this Liberator, David Walker put out this, a runaway slave put out this thing called Walker's Appeal, which is this publication urging slaves to stand up for their humanity, that slaves are being oppressed by violent American slave oppression, and that it's time to seize your manhood and free yourselves, etc. So in other words, I'm just bringing up the point that there's plenty, and we should be well aware of this, many active, very articulate Black abolitionists at the same time as you have white abolitionists like Lundy and Garrison and the Tappan brothers, etc. But that's Garrison's position, and he keeps to it. From the early 1830s, he's right there in the forefront of abolitionism up until his death, which Kendi points out is in the late 1870s. So that's, 50 years of fervent, very, forthcoming abolitionism. And he does believe that this is a cause that must be done. Now, Kendi works with this interesting binary, which is either racist or anti-racist. You've been working on this book for a while, you know that. I'm not fully down with that. We don't need to get in that right now. I'm not.
Yeah, but we will talk about that because that's what makes the conversation really interesting.
Right, yeah, but that's Kendi's framework. It's a useful framework. It's useful. Now, Garrison, along with many other white abolitionists and some of the more, some of the Black abolitionists too, weren't entirely sure, as I mentioned before, that freed slaves who they saw as uneducated, and coming from a background, and here we have to link in to tie back to a belief about Africa itself, that Africa itself was a very backward place. You know, one of the things I should point out that, you know, we don't really have in the forefront of our social discussions today, but was in the forefront then, was this idea of Christianity. Christianity at the forefront. And, you know, the Western world, Europe and North America, South America, Latin America too, were seen as Christendom, you know, lands of Christianity, advancement, you know, civilization. Africa, for the most part, was seen as a land of what were called heathens, okay? People who were not Christians at the time, and we do need, to be a good historian, you have to avoid what we call presentism. You need to understand the past in its context. In the context of the time, Africa was seen as, first of all, unknown. Secondly, as being very violent. Third, I'm speaking broadly. I mean, not everyone believed that, but many.
Us to think that way.
It was a sort of about the conventional thinking, and people uneducated, you know, primitive, you know, basically farmers and warriors, and, you know, people without advanced civilization, illiterate, all these negative things. And you see it in the poems of Phyllis Wheatley. I'm not sure if this course
Yes,
discussed Phyllis Wheatley, but, you know, a slave herself, and not happy being a slave. You know, she wrote a number of documents urging liberty during the time of the Revolution. But she does have that famous poem where she gives thanks for being redeemed and brought out of heathen Africa and brought into the land of Christian civilization, which she sees as saving her soul. So many people saw Africa in this very negative light. And that's partly why people like Garrison, the Tappan brothers, some of the Black abolitionists, when you look at the backgrounds of Africa, or to see as a very backward place, heathen place, and you look also at the living conditions of slaves in the South, which obviously are typically uneducated, doing hard labor, we put those two things together, you end up with a preconception of people who have a long way to go before they can join the ranks of sophisticated civilized society. And I think that's the intellectual trap that people like Garrison fall into. They lack confidence in the capacity of the, let's say, the run-of-the-mill slave, freed slave, to be part of an advanced society without some kind of preconditioning, you know, something to elevate them to be part of this society. And, you know, you can go way back. A guy named Anthony Benezet, back in colonial Philadelphia, Quaker, saw well, there was still slavery in Philadelphia, but he saw, you know, young Black children who were not being educated. And he said they had the potential to be creative members of society. He believed in something like Black equality with education, and opened a school to educate these young Blacks. But what you do see among a wide range of I'll just say Northern thinkers at this time, is this general belief that the Black population is not ready, for the most part, with some exceptions, to be part of the society, the democracy, this new republic that we're building here. And that's, I think, the issue. And that's why Kendi, I think, looks at Garrison with a lot of reserve. I think he appreciates Garrison's efforts and the efforts of allied abolitionists as well. And he also goes into Frederick Douglass. But he has a certain reservation about their beliefs of Black capacity to live as part of an advanced society. And I think that's the issue. I wanted to do something else before we got into freer discussion, and it gets into this idea of colonization. And many of you reading this section were looking at that probably with some, you know, curiosity. This is an idea that free Blacks will never live a life here in North America that is harmonious, will never live in terms of ease or social acceptance with whites. There might be a race war at some point, almost a genocidal race war could break out, as happened in Haiti. Many of these folks look at Haiti. And so a number of people, including, and I noticed that Kendi didn't mention this, interesting. A number of Black activists, thinking about someone, you know, blanking on his name, but Paul Cuffey, a New England Black ship owner, pretty affluent person, believe in this idea of colonization, that, you know, Blacks will never live in harmony here. So the thing is to migrate back to the homeland. And the British had set up a colony called Sierra Leone on the coast of Africa. They bought some land and set up this colony. And Cuffee was interested in moving, at least, and he moved some blacks there. It's almost inconceivable this could be done in the shipping of the time to move the entire population back. But once Cuffee introduces the idea, a number of whites get involved too, and that's of course this American Colonization Society. You know, people like Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star Spangled Banner. You know, people like Henry Clay. The idea that the black population, and initially they're thinking of hoping to emancipate the entire black population at some point and move them back to Africa. Eventually, they whittle it down to just the free blacks, you know, who were in the North and Midwest. Something I noticed, and this says something about Anglo-American racial thinking. All of you know slavery was widespread throughout the Americas. Brutal slavery, Venezuela, Colombia, Brazil, you know, Peru. None of these other countries that I've found ever had any kind of high-profile colonization movement, an idea that freed slaves there should be sent back to Africa. The people of those nations, I guess you'd say the whites, the Iberian background whites, despite their violent, you know, slave races and, you know, slavery and racism, seem to have had some kind of a confidence that freed slaves could fit into society as it was, where it was. And I've never seen any evidence of a major colonization impulse in any of those countries. Yet here it was. I think it says something about Anglo-American thought at the time about racial harmony and racial mixing. The English are an island people. I often trace it back to that. They don't have, you know, little as Europeans have a capacity for seeing heathens as being equal. The English have even less. They traditionally have seen themselves as a people apart. They haven't mixed a lot with foreigners or non-whites up to the 1500s, 1600s. And I kind of see that hesitance in Anglo-American thinking that they could ever live in harmony with this large black population. So here, unique among the American slaveholding nations, you see this colonization movement, and some blacks go. I mean, I think if you read the text, you'll see that an offer was made in the late 18 teens in Philadelphia to free blacks in Philadelphia. You know, who wants to go to Sierra Leone or West Africa? And it was almost entirely turned down. No interest in going. They felt that this was their land, which they built, had fought for in the revolution, contributed to. A few blacks went to Liberia over the decades, several thousand. And Liberia today does have, and Sierra Leone too, a visible, what we call Americo-African population. You know, people who came from here and settled there. But it never was a really popular thing, American blacks. And oftentimes, colonization activists were seen as racists, trying to free the country of what they themselves called a dangerous, degraded, pernicious population of free blacks. And many blacks saw that idea as being a way to get rid of accomplished blacks who might be troublesome and maintain the massive blacks in slavery. So colonization, for various reasons, never caught on among the massive American blacks. And you'll see as you go, not to take away from future pages of this book. Abraham Lincoln was involved in that idea up until around 1863, 64. And after that, except for a second revival in the 1880s, 1890s, there is another revival among Black Americans because of bad conditions in the South. But colonization, for the most part, just falls by the wayside after the 1860s. That's me going on a long way. And I know this is more of a free conversation, so I'll just hold off there. I've got some other ideas, but let's see what how the conversation goes.
Right. I just want to say that Kendi did bring up Liberia, Libya, and other places in with W.E.B. Du Bois section. Right. So he did bring up that idea of moving back to Africa, and you had the UNIA, Universal Negro,
right.
You know, thing, yes, Garvey, the Garvey movement, and so forth. So he did bring up that information in that section. But before you go, yes, we're going to have this but before you go, I just want to ask you one question. Why do you think that there was a split between Frederick Douglass and Garrison? what do you think? Why do you think that happened? I'm just asking it as I know the answer to it, but why do you? Could you just share that with
Yeah,
us?
I think Douglas saw Garrison as condescending. Douglas was, strongly allied with Garrison for quite a while, and, speaking and touring in the anti-slavery movement. But frankly, Garrison wanted to be the leader and lacked confidence that Douglas, as a freed slave, had the capacity to really manage and effectively run a movement like this. And actually, so Garrison, in a sense, Douglas saw as taking away agency from Douglas, lacking confidence in Douglas. I think they had a split about that. They had other divisions too over politics. For instance, Douglas, interestingly enough, endorsed the Constitution as an anti-slavery document, as did Abraham Lincoln later on. He didn't like the idea that Garrison was, and Garrison never wavered from this, calling the Constitution a document that basically is, as I mentioned before, is a pact with the devil to sanctify and protect slavery. That was Garrison's interpretation. Douglas saw that as politically untenable. I mean, Douglas, you have to give the man incredible. I haven't finished David Blight's biography of Douglas. There's a new book about him. But, his political skills, his speaking skills, the way he framed arguments are just unmatched. And it's a shame that Garrison and he had to split really over agency and leadership and some other issues too, because they really were going in the same direction.
Okay.
They really had the same end goal. And it's quite unfortunate that happened. But, movements can be factional. You see similar splits in the feminist movement later on. So it's, on one hand, you mourn it. On the other hand, you know that this happens in any kind of organized movement where you have people who have strong ideas.
Okay. So let's bring in the others. And I do want to come back, to the idea of assimilating into a culture, because I felt that also Douglas had that mentality as well.
Very much.
Yes. So any other thoughts about what you read in the book and that jumped out at you? Audience, friends, anyone?
Maybe if I could kind of chime in a little bit in no particular order. First of all, I wanted to mention to the host, I'm looking for the chat function, the chat option, and I can't find it on my screen. I wanted to comment on some of the things that Brian was saying, and I don't know, for some reason, it's just not coming up on my screen. Okay, so maybe it's just the version of Zoom. Well, thank you for having this. This is amazing and continues to be an amazing conversation. This is what now, our third time meeting?
Yes.
Yeah, it is. Feels like the third time. And those of you who know me know that I'm a sociologist. So sociologists tend to be criticized by their historian colleagues as being ahistorical, and quite often that charge and that criticism is warranted. Having said that, I use this as a disclaimer because as I'm reading Kendi, I have to kind of pause and wonder, right? And I say this again, as somebody who's not a historian, but has sort of like a critical eye for some of the observations that he's made. And some of the language that he uses, language like integrationist, assimilationist, abolitionist. I wonder if, borrowing from, a term that Brian Allnut used earlier, I wonder if Kendi is somewhat guilty of a presentist bias in some way. So the book begins, if you remember, there's I think it was the introduction of the first chapter, where Kendi lays out the distinction between an assimilationist who's basically an integrationist versus an anti-racist. So you have these kind of different camps, and of course the pro-slavery. So you have these sort of like three ideological views or paths. And I get the feeling as I read Kendi that it's very hard to find, even in the most well-meaning anti-slavery abolitionist person like like Garrison and others, it seems that their view of Blacks, of Africans, are so tainted with racism. And I wonder if Kendi, how do I say this? I wonder if he is using, in a way, a presentist bias to judge their viewpoint, given that it's 1850 something or 1840 something. I don't know if this is something that Brian can respond. So if I put somebody like these guys in context, these people are amazing. I mean, these people, they were activists in the face of potential death and potential threats. So again, I'm not trying to be an apologist in this sense, but I really wonder if we are kind of making, we are quick to judge people like these as overly assimilationist, overly integrationist, and therefore, they have some kind of either deep-rooted or unintentional racism that kept them from being these anti-racists. And I wonder if we're judging them a little too harshly. I wonder if I don't know if you guys understand my question. So I'm just going to kind of throw it out there.
I do understand what you're saying, and I think he argued both points, because he did bring up the fact that Garrison later on understood the way that he was thinking, that perhaps painting all blacks into a particular canvas or a particular picture. And then I think with all of these characters, he shows the growth of how they were a certain way in the beginning, and then the growth of them. And when you go into W.E.B. Du Bois was the same thing too. Again, that whole concept, but you cannot, you couldn't blame them for that period because of the
Correct.
fact that the European was the dominant, and so that was the image that they wanted blacks to assimilate to become.
Right.
And
I understand that. But go ahead, finish your thought, Raya.
I was just going to say, and then there is this disconnection as far as when you see the freed blacks. And again, I don't want to get into that because that's also going to be a totally separate discussion. When you look at the freed blacks or the talented 10, or or the biracial group, again, I get a sense, and I see it with the whole brainwashing of us and the psychological effect that it had on our minds over time. But it was strictly done that way so that, again, we can assimilate into this culture, and we have to act like them. And if we act like them and behave like them, then we are a good Negro. We're a good Black person.
And at worst, it's a catch-22. So you're damned if you do assimilate, and you're damned if you don't.
Yeah.
And that's,
I would say, I have a lot to say about this. I want to see some of our other people get involved and I have a lot I could say. I think Kendi's, well, there's a couple things. You could frame this two ways. He's either guilty of an intellectual error here, or he's committing an intellectual sleight of hand at carrying on the ideas of mid-19th century Americans about Africans' position, first of all, the quality of Africans in general, and their position in American society, and using terms that we use today, and carrying it into the present, which I think is not intellectually sustainable at all. So that's something we'll get into a little bit later on, but I'd like to hear what everyone else has to say about this, because it's actually one of the gists of what he's arguing here, and as he takes us from the abolitionist days up until the violent collapse of Reconstruction in the 1870s, 1880s. What else? What are the thoughts? What are reactions that people have? I'm just curious.
Janine, what is it? You had your hand up. What is it that jumped out at you as you read? And someone did send me a statement to read. That go ahead, Janine, if you have something to say.
Yeah, Brian, I was thinking about your in the beginning when you were first speaking, you were talking about how the biblical texts are taken, and they're just kind of used as this fuel for whatever racist policy. And so you see that, and there's one point, and I can't find the page at this moment, but there's one point where you can literally just take any text and just make it mean whatever you want it to mean for those in power. But what I think is kind of important, and it goes to we're talking about assimilation. So there's two things I kind of want to discuss, since we are tying the past to the present. But this idea that, if you assimilate, I'm thinking of all the cultures and religions, and this is mentioned in the section, I believe it's the section for, I think it's Ready for Freedom in the beginning. This idea that you have these quote unquote like African people and their jargon and their, kind of their religion that is, because they're not understanding the context of their religion, they are assuming it is this, this inferior kind of spirituality. But you also see the way religion is used. Quakers are Kendi kind of lifts up Quakers in a way that's very positive in some areas, where he's saying they're pacifist, and they are abolitionists, and they are against slavery. And in another sense too, and Garrison kind of fits into this mold, where it's like, yes, they might be abolitionists, but I believe it's Garrison says in the beginning of Douglas's book that, I'm trying to find the direct quote because I think it's important. This is on page 184. Garrison had packaged the book and his assimilationist idea of the enslaved or free African as actually subpar, someone capable of high attainments as an intellectual and moral being, needing nothing but a comparatively small amount of cultivation to make him an ornament to society and a blessing to his race. So it's this idea that still, I really don't hear a lot of equality. I don't hear a lot of we're so far from equity at this point, or even justice, so I don't even want to go there. But going back to the religious portion of this, is that Quakers kind of have this, I believe, at the same idea, and that there's this idea currently that we have, and this is what I mentioned in our first talk with liberation theology, is the idea that we are reading text from the margins. So there's this idea that in the text, people are reading into the text, right? So you have these white slave owners and just white people in general just using the text and reading into it and saying, this is what this means, and the Africans are from Ham, and this is why they are inferior, and all this terrible stuff. And so what I kind of want to say, just as an aside to this conversation, is that this is still very much an issue today. So I don't want us to read this, and when we see all the religious parts, I know they're kind of sprinkled through these sections, but they're, the American, I'm going to say American Christianity here, is still existing, and it's still prominent. It doesn't look the same way, but it is still present. And people still do that. They read into the text. We call that eisegesis, where you take your current context. And Brian, I kind of hear this as when we even talk about Kendi bringing the present into kind of reading in light of the present. But at the same time, we do this with our religion too. We take our current situation, we read into the text our context instead of looking at the context of the text and bringing out what would be meaningful for us and what it says to us during this time, which would be exegesis. So I just think that's an important thing to point out, because we're going to see this continually through the upcoming sections too. Right. And I just read an article. It was an article on, again, tying this to the present, because I think that's where our courageous conversation should go. There was an article on a website called The Soapbox, and it was talking about just earlier this month on December 12th, right 2 days before the Electoral College win for Joe Biden, there was a march called the Jericho March, it was, I believe it was in Washington, right. And the group called the Proud Boys stole a Black Lives Matter sign, and kind of just did this terrible act of destruction. Right. And what we're seeing is there's kind of this war on people that are kind of in the spirit of Martin Luther King, trying to bring to the surface the racism that's happening in our society. And we think that, I don't think we do in this group, but there's a lot of people that think, Martin Luther King came and he kind of fixed everything and racism no longer exists. And because we're even like conversations like this, like since we are talking about racism, that's the reason racism still exists, which is kind of a ridiculous notion, and is not the case. But that there is still destruction, and there are people that are being silenced that are using religious texts in the way that I think they should be used, which is for the cause of liberation, in a way that says that God is on the side of the oppressed. And I'm not saying anybody should believe this. I'm just mentioning what liberation theology entails and what is important as we look in this text in the future. So all this to say that in assimilation, I think it's tough, because we all bring, no matter what, I don't really know if I believe that assimilation is actually something that can happen or should happen. I think we all bring our own, I'm going to say this not in a negative way, but our own baggage, so to speak, of our own our lived experiences, our background, our own religion, our own ways that we've been taught. And in a positive light, we all bring our own culture, and all these things. And part of our lived experience is race, right? So the way I've been treated is radically different than some of my Afro-Latino cousins in Texas, right? It's very different. So trying to circle back, I know I've gone all over the place here, but I just think some of the stuff is important to keep in mind as we're reading these little religious bits about how we've read into the text. And I think it has to do also with Kendi, when we talk about him kind of using the present light to illuminate the past. Because I think in a sense, even if that's a flawed framework, I'm not entirely sure, and maybe someone will correct me, I'm not really entirely sure that can be helped. I think we all do that to some extent. I don't know if that's something that we can necessarily prevent.
Oh, yeah.
I see Saul is here. Welcome, Shalom Alevi. I know you couldn't resist.
I've been here all along. I started out intent that I was not going to participate tonight. I was just going to watch, but the conversation has been so interesting that I wanted to just join it in some way and bring up a couple of points. First, to Kendi's construction of this idea of being a racist or anti-racist. I particularly like that because it frees us from, the categories of either a person is a racist or they're not a racist, right? And when he came to the Lehigh Valley last fall at Lehigh University, and we went to see him, he started his talk by giving quotes from William Lloyd Garrison. And, for everyone who was familiar with Garrison, we thought of Garrison as one of the good guys, which he is. I mean, he's the president of the American Anti-Slavery Society. And so for a lot of people, they were shocked to hear some of the racist things that the president of the American Anti-Slavery Society would say. And I thought that was very clever of Kendi to use that to illustrate that even a committed abolitionist, right, could make statements or have beliefs at different times that we today would recognize to be racist, right? When he says basically, that slavery has degraded Black people to the level that they've become like animals. Obviously, we can see how problematic that statement is today, but, this then gives us a way to say, you can't judge a person by one statement or act for their entire lives, but you can look at any moment and say, what are they doing at this moment? At this moment, he is engaged in anti-slavery work or anti-racist work, or do this action at that moment and that thing you're doing is racist, right? And so we could be both, racist and anti-racist at different points of our lives in different ways. And so, that's why it's better to say, rather than describe a person, describe their actions, right? And let that speak for itself, as opposed to trying to characterize them as being racist or because I'm an abolitionist, I can't be racist, right? one of the things Kennedy pointed out in his other book, How to Be Anti-Racist, is that even Black people can be racist. So you can't say because I'm Black, I can't be racist. You know, and you can see Black people say and do very racist things, right? So I like that either, you know, the action in question, you can characterize that action at that moment as being racist, anti-racist, and what you want to do. Now, as far as whether we should judge people presentism, right? I think that has different meanings in history. One is a kind of teleological view, meaning you view the past as leading to the present. Everything that happened in the past was leading to that moment. That's an intellectual ideological mistake. However, what most people I think are referring to when they say presentism is rather judging people in the past by the standards of the present.
Right.
And I think that that could be a problem, but in this case, when we talk about racism, it's totally valid. Because what we assume to be present values, what do you mean by the present values? You mean justice? You mean freedom? You mean equality? Those are not present values. Those are values and positions that people knew then, especially if you are arriving at them through what? Your religious tradition, right? The Bible wasn't written yesterday, right? They had access to that literature, to Moses and Jesus and Confucius and Socrates. So if they didn't and you did, then you could say, well, it's unfair to judge them, you know, about their views, you know, on Marx, Karl Marx before Marx, right? Because that was before their time. But if you're using, you know, value literature and figures that they had access to and frankly read more thoroughly than we did today, you know, this was totally, you know, within their realm of understanding. The
Right.
fact that they didn't recognize it or apply it is their fault, not a lack of knowledge or access to information. And also, I think the fact that there were people who did recognize it, which proves, right, that you could live in that time and understand that these things were inherently morally wrong from the beginning. And the fact that some people were able to see that and do that, I think means that all people could have. And it really took a great effort not to see it and not to recognize it. And Kennedy does a good job with that with Jefferson to show how intelligent, well-informed people could go through all kinds of contortions and rationalizations and justifications to continue doing what they know to be wrong, right? So to say, well, we apply our standards as if they didn't know these things, right? They knew it and they were conflicted by it. And I think the last thing I wanted to say, because Brian mentioned David Blight's book on Frederick Douglass. I'm up to that point where Douglass is in London. His book, The Narrative of 1845, has just come out. William Lloyd Garrison wrote the introduction to that book, which I think the previous speaker says, you know, in that where Douglass, Garrison describes Douglass as kind of like a credit to his race, something white liberals will say almost up to the present, you know. This kind of exceptionalism, he does that, you know. But Douglass is, the last speech he gives in London before getting on the ship to come back to America, he says to the Europeans that America is a country, a nation of inconsistencies, a nation of inconsistencies, right? And this is where, you know, you see the relationship between Garrison, you know, and Douglass starting to separate because Douglass is starting to think for himself, right? As a Garrisonian, relationship between Garrison and Douglass, Garrison discovers Douglass, right? I mean, he's speaking in Nantucket, Massachusetts, and Douglass comes to hear these white people who want to abolish slavery. He's very curious about who they are and what they're like. And Garrison says, if you don't believe what I'm saying about slavery, we have Black people here who were actually slaves who could validate what I'm saying. He calls them Douglass. And then he invites Douglass to speak professionally with him and join the American Anti-Slavery Society. So their relationship starts as like, Garrison is like, I discovered you, right? I plucked you out of obscurity. And now Douglass is, you know, emerging as his own person, his own fame, his own orbit. His books are selling more than any white abolitionist. And then he'll come back and start his own newspaper, the Northern Star, which becomes a rival to the Liberator, right? And then when he breaks with Garrison on the point that Brian mentioned about the Constitution, right, and starts to interpret it, well, maybe we could work with it. Maybe you could look at it also as a pro-liberty and freedom document. And then on the question of voting, right? So they believe in moral suasion. They're also pacifists. And Douglass is starting to move and say, well, maybe we should be looking at using the political apparatus, reinterpreting the Constitution, and ultimately the question of violence, right? Would war be necessary, right? And Garrison and the abolitionists are like, totally opposed to that. So as Douglass starts to grow, right, and change and be able to break away and move away, from Garrison and think on his own and establish his own kind of identity and become an intellectual rival, I think is significant in that growth. And I think I'll leave it at that.
But also Garrison wanted to shape Douglass into a particular type of image, and Douglass wasn't accepting that. And again, that's the whole concept of integration and forcing someone to emulate a certain group. And because, like you said, Douglass was becoming more intellectual and more, outspoken and so forth. So he decided to reshape himself. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think Garrison was trying to shape Douglass to be the person that he wanted him to be.
Yeah, Henry Louis Gates writes about this in terms of style, right? That when he first discovers Douglass, and I say discovered him, right? He was very kind of nervous and inarticulate, and he would just give like descriptions of what slavery was like. And then he becomes very eloquent, almost poetic in some ways, right? And Garrison says to him at one point, could you put more of the plantation back in your voice?
Right.
The way you used to speak, you used to really sound like a slave.
Right, exactly.
So, in my classes, I talk about wanting to keep it real. I mean, right. You don't sound Black anymore.
Right.
Right. You don't sound like a real slave.
Right,
anymore.
right.
Whereas you have more credibility, when I found you there in Massachusetts, you spoke like a slave, you sounded like a slave, you get up there. And then what it also meant in terms of tensions between Blacks and whites in progressive organizations is who does what, right? And when he comes into the organization, he's the illustration, right? And the white abolitionists, Wendell Phillips and Garrison and others, they determine policy and strategy and tactic and, and so you're just supposed to come on and illustrate what we're saying and to help us with the fundraising and, but you're not supposed to be one of the kind of intellectual leaders of that. And as Douglass moves from, stage entertainer, performer to, I actually have ideas and some of my ideas are different from your ideas about where the movement should be going, what the organization should be doing, right? That role is changing. And even in the way that he speaks, that you don't sound like, like an ex-slave, which is part of Garrison's concern is your believability. We're trying to persuade people here, right? And we have people who are saying that this is all made up and that these Black people are either paid actors or Northern people who are lying about how bad slavery is, right? And so people can challenge your credibility by saying that this is a work of fiction, like Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? So when Harriet Beecher Stowe publishes that, she admits this is a work of fiction. There is no Uncle Tom, right? And Southerners criticize it as distorting like how bad slavery is. When Douglass writes his book, he's like, this is what happened, right? These are real people. This is the plantation. This is the name of the owner. These are facts that you could check out. And so, his credibility is a question. So I think that's enough out there for us to
Right.
mull over.
Okay, so yes, anyone else? Anybody wants to jump in before Janine? I know Janine will have a lot. Anyone else want to contribute so far about what we're talking about, or even bringing it up to the current, to modern day society and what's going on too?
Don't you think that maybe this is human behavior? Human behavior versus power and holding your place in society. So we see it there. And let's say we see it today with the $600 versus the $2,000 CARES Act. I can't think of the new name for it. And some people holding power and not wanting to acknowledge that people need this money, and they think that people are lazy and they won't go work even though there's not jobs for people. Don't you think these are the same kinds of arguments that today, that in some ways than what we're talking about with Garrison and that time?
Can I reply to Randy? I would like to
Go ahead,
respond to
please.
Randy.
Yes.
And then it brings us back to this whole question of integration. So, Randy, I agree with you. I cannot help, although I said that we have this kind of presentist bias and it's hard to get away from it, I couldn't help but see these parallels. So one of the things that struck me, and I wish Kendi would have talked more about the Black position, I would have liked to have heard more about, Black activists, etc. What struck me, which was, I think, really fascinating, and I think students need to know this, is the response, the collective response of some in the Black community to this idea of going back to Africa, of being shipped back to Africa. They were completely opposed to this. They were like, no, we are Native people. We are as American as you and me. And if you bring it back to today's world, right, see protesters, Black and white, right, or folks basically stereotyping the Black Lives Movement and basically looking at them as a bunch of, troublemakers and rabble-rousers. We still have those fears and tropes of the angry Black person, etc. And what I love about Kendi is that he, whether he does it intentionally or not, he shows us that there is a multiplicity, that there is a variety of voices, of different ideas. You can't even talk about a one white way of thinking or one white way of, right, of voting. So I love the fact that he's giving all these, different voices within all the communities, such a voice. So Randy, you made a really, really good point there. And I think this is another good reason to really push, history in our classes, whether it's public school or college or what have you. Seriously, read our history. If you want to know where we are now, look at how we don't seem to learn from our past. These kinds of themes are repeated over and over again.
One of the things you see is if you go up to the post-Civil War section of Kendi's parts, he's talking about how a lot of Northern reformers look at the freed slaves as
Right.
needing motivation to work. Like they're not going to work hard, they're too lazy to work. This was a time of a lot of views of lower class people like
Precisely,
that.
precisely.
People. I was reading a speech that was given to some freed slaves on the coast of Georgia by a Union officer. Basically was saying, you've been fed up until now and taken care of by your master. Now you're going to need to make your own way. And it's sort of a very,
Patronizing.
you need to make your own way and raise your own food. It's not going to be done for you anymore. And an almost identical speech was given to returning Union veterans in Rochester, New York, when they arrived back in Rochester. And the local politicians said, oh, the Army took care of you. You've been fed, you've been housed. Now we expect you to stand on your own 2 feet and make your living by hard work. Let's see if you can do it. So this kind of sort of diatribe and distrust of lower class people not to work on their own was widespread in the late 19th century. And you do see it arise in our time, clearly in the discussion about, just to bring it up about these pandemic relief checks.
Precisely.
Oh, give them too much, they won't work. People are lazy, they won't work. And it's very much that late 19th century Gilded Age view that lower class people, socialized people, of various races, don't have the self-discipline to work unless someone tells them to and rams it home that they must work. They won't do it on their own. They're not self-motivated enough. They don't have the drive or the whatever capacity there is. And that's very parallel to some things you're seeing today.
Yeah, I was struck by the not ready. Blacks are not ready against how much that plays into racism today in the context of if you are aspirational, then you are also damned because we don't think you are ready. And if you are aspirational, then you are overstepping your grounds. And that may even play into if you have some adaptation to the expectations of white people, if you aspire to some dimensions of the aspirational that relate to integration or assimilation, you are also damned. So I'm just thinking of those two. When you said earlier, or when somebody said that you can be both racist and non-racist, you can also be, you're not ready to be part of our society, but if you are aspirational, don't you dare presume kind of thing. And I think we see a lot of that today. And
Don't.
I was struck by your pointing that out historically. I thought that was interesting.
Janine?
Well, we're a few points removed from what I originally was thinking about, but I'm thinking of, there's this part in the beginning of chapter 17 where Kendi's talking about Black Confederates defending slavery. And so I keep thinking about whether that's present day or back then, like what are the choices our Black siblings have right now? What are the choices that they had back then? And the way we like to frame or box things in with like the way we color people in terms of they're good or they're bad or they're racist or they're not racist. Sometimes like the choices are so limited. So like, for example, this is on page 215. He's talking, Dr. Kendi's talking about the Black Confederates defending slavery. He says, there have always been individual truths to support every generalized racist lie. It is true that some Black opportunists sought favor if slavery persisted by supporting the Confederate cause. It is true that some starving free Blacks supported the rebels for life-saving provisions, right? They're gonna die if they don't, basically, right? It is true that Black racists who believe that Black people were better off enslaved sometimes voluntarily aided the Confederacy. The number of voluntary Black Confederates, probably not many, but no one can say for sure. And I don't know, I'm thinking about this past election. I'm thinking about, and these are just thoughts, I'm not making statements about anything. I'm thinking about people's lived experiences and what their perceptions are of their choices, right? So, I know this is a courageous conversation, right? But just in terms, I'm thinking, because I'm Puerto Rican, I'm thinking of Latinos for Trump, and I'm thinking of how, depending on where you came from and your culture and your background and what had been given to you or not given to you, which candidate you might support, right? And so there are so many facets to each one of these issues that I think it's so hard without looking at that person's entire background, and there's no way you can do this now. But is there really a way that we can call people, we're not calling people good or bad, but even like I'm struggling with even just calling people anti-racist or racist. And that's why I think I like Kendi's framework of him saying that we have to look at the individual actions. You know, if you are a racist person, I'm talking about presently, if you call someone a racist today, that's not really their identity. It's just that they did a racist thing. So maybe you said, hey, that action was racist. And there's a way that you can change your action next time, right? Given your choice or given choices that you have available to you. So I don't know, I'm still kind of cautious with the way we're reading some of this too. And I just keep thinking of what were the choices available. And I appreciate Saul's point that that in some cases, like they were given everything they needed to know and they could have made the right choice all along, and people like Jefferson and others were just hesitant all the way through. So I can appreciate that, but I'm wondering if I just can't say that that's the case for everybody. And I think we have to look at what people's choices are in front of them or what they perceive their choices to be. And that backs their action, whatever that is. And I think that's the case presently. And I think that's the case here too.
Right. And, I just want to say something, and, thinking about that, what Janine just said, I just got to read in a book, Me and White Supremacy by Sad, and she speaks about white silence. And so even though they know that certain things are not right, or they shouldn't do certain things, they remain silent because it's either it benefits them or they're probably afraid of the ramification, or they hope that it will die out and it will it would end and nobody we don't have to deal with this anymore. So instead of actually dealing with the situation, when certain things are brought to the forefront, the silence is like there is this dead silence when people are not refuse to face the facts of what's going on. And throughout, if you look throughout these all the chapters that we've read, from Cotton Mather to now Garrison. So Garrison, they all realized that there was this systemic way of life, slavery and the way Blacks were treated. They knew that it was wrong, like what Saul was. They knew that it was wrong, but yet they decide, for one, and it could be, again, power, finance, economic, the economic aspect of it, the reason why they decide to walk gingerly with certain issues.
I really love this conversation. In my life, I rarely was around such wonderful scholars and such great conversations. But in some ways, what I'm hearing a lot of is trauma that's not transformed gets transferred. And it becomes generational, it becomes historical, and yeah, I was recently part of a Jews for Allies meeting, and I was in a small group with Jewish women and men who were 35 and under, and they were talking about nightmares that they're having that all talked about the Holocaust, reflected the Holocaust. And I was just so taken back because most of them didn't talk much about it. Their parents had stopped talking about it. But in still having nightmares about it, in the cattle cars, in the ovens, in fire. I was just so struck by that they are still having nightmares, even though for most of their life they've been disassociated from it. And then, have you noticed Black people tend to not trust police? And then there's another piece of information that I've learned, that the first Black police department formed in the United States was formed for the purpose of capturing runaway slaves. And you start threading then this trauma that's not transformed is transferred. And now his science, I'm not a historian, but I'm reading that science, and I'm not a scientist either. I'm a grandfather. And what I'm hearing scientists say now is that it actually gets passed on through DNA, trauma that's not transformed. And I think I struggle when I hear white people say to me, I was raised by good people. They were God-fearing, loving people, and they did all the right things, and they taught me to do all the right things, and I'm just like them, and I don't see color. And then, you know, what I say to them now is, wow, and yet here we are. So I don't know. I guess the definition of crazy is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. I think we're in this crazy phase, if you will, because I keep hearing that we're repeating history over and over and over, and we're not doing things different to make things change. And I don't know. I don't know if that was useful for you or not, but I just think there's a place where I would love for courageous conversations to be normal conversations.
Guillermo, I so glad you spoke and said what you did. That meant a lot to me. It helps me put words to thoughts that I didn't know, you know, where exactly I was going with. So I really appreciate what you said. And I'm wondering, hopefully now we can push and make this a moment where we can actually change and transform, if not everything, because I hate to be negative, Nellie, but I doubt that. But we can still push through. There are corporations hopefully doing the work to get more diversity and change policies within corporations and things like that to push a little more on the envelope to try to change some of these behaviors that we keep repeating and repeating.
Any other comments? But Brian, do you have anything to say? Do you have anything to say? So again, because I just want to, I was going to end with this, but because Ronit brought it up, and you know the fact about our children and teaching our children, because and this is one of the reasons why we are having these conversations, is because we think of the next generation. We think of the next generation and educating the next generation, but how can we talk about these discussions if we are afraid to talk about these issues, I should say, if we are afraid to be open about certain issues, or we are hesitant, and so therefore, you know, people are somewhat hesitant when it comes to talking about race and racism. And there was this article that someone actually, you know, told me to look at, the Psychology Network magazine, and it's dealing with, you know, teach your children well. Can therapists help parents raise anti-racist kids? And what got me is that some white parents maintain silence because they don't want to upset their children. But others may keep quiet because they don't think racism is a significant problem to begin with. In the national, and I'm going to skip that. When parents shrug their shoulders about racism, this is what the author is saying. When parents shrug their shoulders about racism, they abandon children to their still emergent capacity to make sense of the world. And if a white person says we are all the same and say nothing else, kids will draw their own conclusion. And here is another important point. I mean, this is like right on point, and and this is something that we could, you know, branch off into as well. If a white child sees a part of the city where houses are crammed together and there are no trees, and it's not as pretty as their own neighborhood, then they see only, and they see only Black people living there, they might think there must be something wrong with those people. If the child isn't aware of racial injustice, that's a logical conclusion, and that's why parents need to talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, I see that in my classes all the time. And it's unfortunate how few, think about how few American kids really get a college education. It's not that many. High schools, not to broadly say anything about the high school framework because it varies by town, but my experience is that they're really not delving into this very much. And so my task in history is to educate all the students, whatever racial background, on the facts of America's racial past, how we got where we are today. And it's amazing how few of them know anything about that. It's terra nova to them. And had they not known about, for instance, the background of severe job discrimination, for decades and decades and decades, they could easily see a poor neighborhood full of Black or Latino kids or people, not just kids, but people, and say, oh, wow, why are they there? Oh, as you said, there's something wrong with them, or they want to be there, and without the backgrounds of the decades of deprivation that caused that, they're simply not going to have the tools to know. So I make the effort in my classes, but then again, that's college history. The sad thing is that high school, as far as I know, most high school students are not being exposed to this because it's potentially controversial. High schools avoid controversy like the plague, and they really do. And so many kids are coming out with only the most superficial knowledge of any of this. And it leaves them unable to really delve with the inequalities they see around them in a constructive way. And, I tend to be sort of positive and optimistic about people being able to make the right choices, but without the right information, they're really not able to. One of the things I do, not to be too long-winded, I have a reading about Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania around 1910. People coming into Pittsburgh for work, Blacks, and it compares Black migrants to Pittsburgh and Polish immigrants arriving at the same time. And their work experience, their hiring experience was entirely different. The Polish immigrants could get jobs at the steel mills. Their families could get them jobs at the mills, even though the foremen, who were Anglo-Americans, look at them in racially harsh terms as being simple-minded people, which they did. They would still hire them for these kind of industrial jobs. Blacks arriving were seen as far worse, unreliable, incapable of doing steady work, and they couldn't get good jobs. They could only do the intermittent cleaning jobs, maintenance, things like trash hauling, things that were unstable, irregular, paid very little. And so because of those decades of different hiring experience, these Polish immigrants are able to slowly build up into a blue-collar living that is rather predictable, whereas Pittsburgh Blacks are left decades and decades of instability, unemployment, and marginal neighborhoods. And that's a deep difference. And how many kids in Pittsburgh today would be aware of that? Very few, 1%. So that's why it's so critical to bring this up today. And it's a shame that people don't have these exposures.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm optimistic.
Yeah.
I'm optimistic about the future because I do think that experiences change people. And the more integrated our society becomes, just mere contact educates them, right? Not necessarily what they're learning in class that they should be learning, that they're not learning, but actual contact and the differences in generations, right? The younger people today are so much more comfortable with differences of all kinds, racial, gender, sexual, and that's encouraging. And the examples that they're seeing. I mean, one of the things about, as we said, about Garrison and also Lincoln, as they met, exceptional and intelligent Black people, it had an effect on them, right? So Garrison had never met anyone like Douglas before. Lincoln, when he runs for the Senate, he says in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, I am against slavery. I don't try to deny that. I'm totally against slavery. But no, I don't think Black people should be allowed to vote. I don't think Black people should be able to hold office, right? I don't believe in interracial relationships. And so by 1864, when he starts to change his position, he says, well, the Black soldiers who fought in the Civil War have, in his opinion, earned the right to be American citizens. And by this point, he's met people like Frederick Douglass, right? Lincoln had probably never met a Black person who could even read until he was in his 20s, right? So this is where I think, you know, we could say, well, people's impressions, if you ask them, well, you know, I don't think Black people can understand democracy or voting or the Constitution, no, right? After you meet someone like Frederick Douglass, you can no longer hold that view. It's like, now I have seen Black people who are capable and obviously able to understand and do these things, and it changed him, right? So what he says, I believe in support of what will become the 14th Amendment, that I think those who are very intelligent should be allowed to vote, right? From no Black people to, well, I've seen some who obviously could understand democracy and should be able to vote. And I think that's happening in society. I think Barack Obama's impact, I think Kamala Harris as vice president in a few weeks will change how people see what Black people are capable of doing. And that inevitably will have an impact.
Right. Two things. You know, with you saying that, this is why there's this book. If when someone asks me what's one of the best books that you've ever read, I always say J.A. Rogers, From Superman to Man. And that's the book where you have the senator on the train and you have a porter, and the porter is having a conversation with the senator, and the senator is amazed at the intellectual conversation that he's having with this Black person. And again, that's the whole point. Whereas again, if you don't know an individual, or if you're taught a certain way about a certain group of people, then that's the perception that you're going to hold until you get to know a community, until you get to know a group of people or a set of people. And so I think the reason for me why I have hope in the next generation is, I live vicariously through my son's eyes, and the people, his friends that he has, and the relationship, this huge relationship that they have built, it's like his cousins and his friends are living all over, in different states, and they all know each other. And so he has friends in Bethlehem that knows his cousins, and his cousins have conversations without Levi being in the, his friends actually call his cousins so that they can play games, and they know each other. And so that gives me hope with the next generation, that they could break down these barriers. And so the, and I'm hopeful that, that would, again, that whole imagery, because I said images play a very important part in our psychological makeup. And that article that I just read for you from, the psychology article, again, the psyche, the way the mind works, and the fact that, now Levi group of friends interact, and they're from all different walks of life. I mean, you'll be amazed. From different cultural backgrounds. Different cultural backgrounds. And they all, and what brings them together is this, gaming. And they're not only just gaming, they're having conversations with each other. It's not just they're having actually conversations with each other. So I'm hopeful that their generation, and the fact that we are having this conversation, and the fact that people are listening to our conversations. So there are so many things in play that's weaving throughout our society, that I'm hopeful that it will be a better generation, because at least we're starting, at least we're making an effort, and we're not standing still, and that we're not remaining silent. But we want to see, we hope to build a better world for the next generation. Any other comment? we could probably, yes, Janine.
I feel like maybe we should just end on your note because it's much more positive than what I was going to say. But I'm thinking back, I think it's 2014, there was a statistic that said 3/4 of white people don't have any Black friends. And I'm sure that that has increased a little bit since then, I'm hoping. I don't have anything in front of me to say that it has. But I think it has to be like this, we have to think about, like, going to Saul's point, like the relationships we have, they have to, so yes, that's true, but also is that happening? Like, is that happening to begin with? And Brian, to your point, you already said it, like in high schools, the fact that our history is even controversial. I mean, there are, I think it was a few years ago again, where they were looking at textbooks from Texas and then comparing them to textbooks from California. Brian, are you shaking your head because it's not a good?
That's true. Very true.
Oh, it's true.
Yeah.
Okay.
This contrast. Yeah. The Texas Board of Education was dominated by I'll just say flat out reactionaries who were trying to put in not even historically, you wouldn't even say traditional views. They were reactionary interpretations of history, and that was being sold. All I can say, I hope, that things have changed. That was about 2 or 3 years ago. I have no idea if it has or not. I think Saul's exactly right. The number, and Rhea, the number of relationships, I sense is increasing. I know 2 figures I can put out there, 2 discrete figures. It appears that residential segregation is diminishing somewhat year over year. A place called the Manhattan Institute did a study of residential, block segregation, block by block. It seems to be, it's still pronounced, but it seems to be declining, which is the trend line you want to see. Another thing I'll bring up, one of the discrete point, we all know about the Loving versus Virginia Supreme Court decision. Had a tremendous change in American marriage patterns. And I saw a figure from Pew Research last year, a little striking, among new relationships. These are not existing, but new relationships. They were polling. Something like, and this is I only remember the figure for African Americans. Something like 20-25% of Black men now are engaging in relationships with women of a different race, typically white women. About 20-25%. For women, it's somewhat less, about 10-12%. And that's also true, as I recall, without the actual numbers for other racial groups too. So I think that creates more of a family intimacy kind of relationship over time, extended families. And that, it's not a magic bullet. There's still some bad dynamics in some of those families. But I think it creates more of a closeness between people of different racial backgrounds that will inevitably affect American society over time.
And bringing it back to the coronavirus, not to go in a negative direction, as Janine was saying, I would love to see more support for education, for teachers, for frontline workers. It was music to my ears to hear Raya live vicariously through her son. I get it. I mean, I'm jealous of some of these young people who some, not many, are truly colorblind and they accept each other as people. However, I am seeing a cultural shift in my classroom where if, as a sociologist, I have to bring up race because it's a structural issue. And I am seeing increasingly more and more students look at these discussions as being political and politicized, when really what we're doing is really kind of describing objectively what's going on in society. So, I'll bring in census material, bring in statistics like Brian was talking about. We look at, rates of intermarriage, et cetera. So you do try to expose students to some of these realities. But there is, unfortunately, I think, a shift towards much more of this kind of ideological conservatism, that I see a lot of students just coming into the classroom expecting that, their liberal teachers are going to try to shove some kind of agenda. And I'm very saddened by that, very, very saddened by that. And I don't know how to combat that or to prevent that,
I could piggyback on that. First of all, hello, everybody.
Hi.
I had a lot of troubles with my computer this evening.
Hi, Wendy.
Hi.
Hi, how are you? Tell Wendy, introduce yourself.
I'm Wendy Wilson Fall. I'm at Lafayette College in Africana Studies. And I'm so sorry, I couldn't, my charger wasn't working. My computer died, and this is the best I can do. And it's almost the end, but I'm glad to at least have made it to the end. And I did want to say, I think that antagonism that Ronit is seeing, I think it is transitory.
I hope.
It's a reflection of the politics, the national politics of the last 6 or 7 years. And that even of those kids, I wouldn't be surprised if at least a quarter of them completely change by the time they're 20. Just by virtue of some of the things Sol and Brian and others have been talking about. What Raya was talking about, the people they meet, the places they work. This is though, unless you live in the far Midwest, it's no longer possible to pretend that there aren't many Black people in the United States. It was possible when there was really true segregation.
But Wendy, a lot of these kids are repeating what their parents are saying.
Absolutely. That's why I said when they get to be about 20. Because I teach kids in college.
Right, exactly. So do I.
My class are repeating what their parents say at the beginning of the class. But by the end of the class, they sort of pity their parents and they are sort of furious at how people have lied to them. That is actually a possible outcome.
Good.
So I guess in that way, I am a little optimistic. They don't know any better. You know, and I think that when the kids, I mean, when the politics shifts a little bit in the country, either, I mean, and I'm speaking hopefully, because, you know, we're at a crossroads right now. Either we keep going in that way or we're marching towards civil war. Nobody wants that. So, yeah. But thank you for sharing that. I mean, when I talk to my students, and these are students who've gone to probably very good schools usually, it's not that they just don't know about Black people. They don't know about a whole bunch of stuff. I don't know what's happening in high schools, or how it must be very difficult for teachers who are following, I don't know, some kind of prescribed program, because most of my students know very little geography. They don't even know what a Huguenot is, in spite of their protestations about being white and Protestant. So it's very sad for them. I mean, Black people is just the tip of the iceberg. They don't know where Luxembourg is. You know, they don't know where Nicaragua is. Anyway, thank you for letting me talk a little bit. I'm a latecomer.
So thank you so much, Wendy. So before we go, I just want to touch on the point that Ronit made, you know, as far as, and then, you know, we're going to end it up with, again, you know, assimilation actually. And I don't believe in being colorblind. And so when I tell you about my son and his experiences with his friends, he keeps his identity. They all do. They all keep their cultural identity when interacting with each other. Like, here's an example. I am from the Caribbean, and Levi will play calypso music for his friends. He would listen to calypso music in the background. And so they come to the house, and we have Sabbath dinner. Here we are, we're Black, we're Jewish, and we have Sabbath dinner. And so they're learning from us in that way as well. And so, you know, when it comes to, you know, we don't want people to be colorblind, because that's the whole thing. We want people to keep our identity and our culture, because that's how we learn from each other. And I've always used the analogy of the fall and the fall seasons, and the fact that we don't embrace the fall seasons. We don't go to the Adirondacks or to Vermont to look at one particular leaf during the fall leaf peaking season. We go because of the beauty. We go because of everything that is there that beautifies the fall season. And so therefore it's the same with culture and identity. We embrace who we are. And so we don't lose that concept, because that's how we learn from each other. That's why people like to travel and go to different places, because they learn about the food, they learn about the language, they learn about the culture and the customs. So it's good to keep that part of us, as opposed to, total assimilation into one culture, because then we'll be living in a dull world. And so it is good to me personally, to keep certain cultural experiences, so that, our children would learn from each other. And so I just wanted to say that it's not, to me personally, I don't want people to be colorblind. I don't want my kids to be colorblind, because there are different shades. They're different cultures, they're different identities, and we learn from each other. And so that's my last spiel. That's what I want to say about that. It is 8:03. And Brian, I hope you can join us again next month.
Okay.
And we'll be discussing W.E.B. Du Bois. And we, with W.E.B. Du Bois, we're actually going to be looking at colorism, the Black elite, and the talented 10, and how, again, W.E.B. Du Bois, he went through an evolutionary period, as far as his identity and assimilation, and how he changed. And so we're going to take this to a different level. I think everything is integrated anyway, all our conversations.
And he was a sociologist. He was, true.
His grandfather was from Haiti.
Yes, exactly. And so we're going to look at Du Bois, and again, bringing it into our, our modern day society, and how this, even though, this has been a topic back then, it's still an issue back now when it comes to colorism. And again, that whole concept of the Black elite and upward suasion. So I will send you the information. I will send you the details. And I see Saul is back again. And
I was just going to say goodbye to Brian, wish him a safe trip, and can't wait to see when you get back from Maine.
All right. So thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. And again, I appreciate each one of you. Thank you for joining us. Have a good night.